The winter of 1833 wrapped Millford in a silence so heavy it seemed the river itself had slowed its current to a crawl. The people of the town, simple in their daily habits and bound to the routines of farm, forge, and mill, found their lives shaped by the presence of Saint Swithin's chapel. It sat at the center of the settlement like a stone heart, gray and austere, its spire rising above the wooden homes, yet never ringing the bell that had been hung at the time of its dedication. For 40 years that bell remained still, suspended in the tower as if waiting for a signal that never came. Parishioners whispered that the silence of the bell was a mark of holiness, though others feared it was something else entirely, a silence demanded by God to cover a secret too terrible for sound. Father Ambrose Vallant, who presided over the chapel, never addressed the matter. Ambrose was a man who appeared gentle, soft-spoken, and steady in his gaze. His face was smooth with the kind of practiced calm that drew both admiration and trust from his parishioners. He spoke little about himself except to say he had studied for years in Quebec before being appointed to Millford. People remembered him most for the way he listened. He would place a hand lightly on a shoulder, tilt his head, and seem to draw out burdens without speaking more than a word. In his presence, families surrendered their confessions, their sorrows, and when asked, their children. He encouraged young boys to serve as altar assistants, praising their devotion, their willingness to help, and the purity of their youth. Parents considered it an honor to see their sons chosen for service, believing the priest was preparing them for a lifetime of faith. What they did not see was the careful order in which Ambrose made his selections. There was no randomness in his choices, no mere preference for well-behaved boys or the sons of the devout. Beneath the chapel, hidden in the foundation stone set during the original consecration, was a series of carvings worn smooth by time. The marks formed no words, but Ambrose had spent years deciphering them. He claimed they were not human-made scratches, but sigils passed down from ancient monastic orders who had built chapels as vessels for sacrifice. His interpretation told him that 12 were required, 12 to complete what he called the circle of preservation, a ritual that bound innocence to eternity. It was not faith he sought, but permanence, a way to keep death itself obedient. In his study, Ambrose sat by candlelight through the long winter evenings, marking down the names of boys who fit the carved pattern. He considered their dates of birth, the arrangement of their families, the sequence of their baptisms, and even the illnesses their mothers had endured while carrying them. To the outside world, he seemed merely methodical, concerned for the order and holiness of his parish. But inside his mind, a darker logic was at work. He believed that every life carried a hidden signature, an imprint that dictated how it should be consumed. To him, these boys were not children, but instruments of a grander design, flesh meant to become symbol. By January, he had chosen the first 3. Their families celebrated, never suspecting that Ambrose's hand lingered too long when he rested it on a boy's head, or that his smile never reached his eyes. The boys themselves felt only pride, repeating to one another how fortunate they were to be summoned to the rectory after evening prayers. They carried the anticipation of a secret honor, unaware that they were stepping into the beginning of a process older than the chapel itself. Ambrose began with subtle instructions: fasting before lessons, sleeping on straw mats in the rectory's cold anteroom, and memorizing lines from obscure psalms that spoke not of mercy but of offering. He told them these were trials of devotion, tests of purity. When they faltered, he spoke gently, assuring them that discomfort was the path to grace. What disturbed those who watched from outside was not the suffering, but the way the boys seemed to accept it without complaint. Their parents assumed this was the discipline of piety, the transformation of childish restlessness into holy obedience. Only in rare moments did anyone see the strain. A hollowed look in the eyes, a trembling hand during Mass, a too long silence after a hymn. When one mother asked Ambrose if her son was well, the priest smiled with such calmness that she apologized for doubting him. He explained that preparation always carried a weight, just as Christ bore his cross, and that the boy's endurance was a blessing upon her household. The bell tower above remained silent, its rope coiled neatly in the corner of the vestry, untouched. Some said the bell was cracked, but others whispered that Ambrose had forbidden its use. They believed his explanation that silence deepened prayer, but in truth he could not bear the sound. He feared that if the bell ever rang, it would shatter the careful rhythm of his work, drawing attention where he needed secrecy. For Ambrose, silence was a shield, and the bell's muteness was the perfect emblem of his rule, outwardly sacred, inwardly void. By February, the number of chosen boys had grown to 6. They walked together through the snow, their heads bowed, their small boots leaving narrow tracks that led always to the chapel. Ambrose observed them from his window, studying the lines of their bodies, imagining how each would one day be arranged in the acts he had already drafted in his hidden journal. He felt no pity, no hesitation. To him they were not children but threads in a tapestry he had been commanded to complete. Each step they took toward the chapel was another stitch in a design only he could see, a design he believed had been carved into stone long before his birth. The town grew uneasy as winter deepened. The silence of the bell began to feel oppressive, pressing down on them like the weight of the snow on their roofs. Some wondered why Ambrose never rang it for the passing of the sick or the burial of the old. It was tradition for the bell to mark death, to remind the living of their fragility. Yet in Millford, death passed in silence. Ambrose told them the sound was not needed and that God's voice was carried in the river and the wind. Privately, he wrote in his ledger that sound was profane, that true sacrifice required stillness, and that the bell would only ring when the circle of 12 was complete. By March, whispers began among the older parishioners who remembered the chapel's dedication decades earlier. They recalled the mason who carved the foundation, a man who refused to speak of the symbols he had etched before the stone was laid. He had died within weeks, his body buried without a priest, his family leaving town in haste. No one connected his silence to Ambrose's work, but the memory lingered like a half-forgotten shadow. When Ambrose finally announced that he would soon complete his group of altar boys, the families felt pride. They dressed their sons in clean linen, pressed their hair, and walked them to the chapel with gratitude. They never suspected the truth, that their sons had been chosen not for virtue but for alignment, not for piety but for sacrifice. Ambrose smiled as he greeted each family, his voice warm, his hands steady, his appearance untouched by malice. Yet inside his mind, the bell's silence grew heavier, pressing against his skull with each passing day, reminding him that the circle was not yet finished. He told himself the silence would one day break, not with sound, but with something far more permanent. The snow began to thaw. The river swelled with ice melt, dark and restless. Ambrose stood at the edge of the chapel yard, watching the current drag broken branches downstream. He saw in it the image of what was to come, a procession of innocents carried away in silence, each body absorbed into the current, unseen, unmarked, yet eternal. He closed his eyes, breathed in the cold air, and whispered the first name from his list. For him, the work had already begun. Ambrose Vallant's study was a narrow room above the rectory kitchen, warmed not by fire but by the slow rot of papers and the faint metallic odor of old instruments. To the parishioners it seemed an ordinary priest's chamber, shelves lined with leather-bound volumes of sermons and saints' lives, gifts from benefactors who admired his dedication. Yet behind the appearance of devotion lay something far more deliberate. Mixed among the theological tomes were volumes on human anatomy, dissections printed in fine copperplate from the halls of Paris and London, and pamphlets once passed secretly among physicians who experimented at the edge of law and morality. Ambrose collected them with care, not as curiosities but as blueprints for a plan he believed had been destined for him long before his arrival in Millford. He studied them by candlelight, not seeking understanding of life, but of the ways life could be preserved through controlled destruction. Hidden among these books was one object that none but Ambrose ever touched, a family Bible. Bound in calfskin and worn at the edges, sat on his desk in plain sight. To the casual eye it was nothing unusual, but within its hollowed binding rested a catalogue of his own creation. Thin pages folded carefully, each written in his steady, meticulous hand. The catalogue contained not sermons nor notes of devotion, but a list of boys already chosen, each name paired with a method he had designed for their eventual sacrifice. The words were clean, free of smudge or hesitation, as though he were recording sacred rites rather than acts of brutality. The methods described were not the blunt punishments of common execution. They were intricate, symbolic, meant to transform each child into something beyond human, a form that would resist decay and carry forward the purity Ambrose believed was locked within them. One page described immersion in salt brine with pearl dust, drawn from Venetian experiments once meant to preserve relics of saints. Another detailed entombment in living stone, a practice whispered of in papal courts where offenders were bricked alive into walls, their voices absorbed into silence. Each design was not only about suffering but about the transformation of flesh into permanence. The catalogue was a gentleman's ledger of cruelty, organized with precision, every entry an echo of historical practices that had been outlawed for centuries yet preserved in his private study. For Ambrose, this was not murder. Murder was chaos, an end without meaning. His work was preservation, devotion to a higher law that others feared to name. He wrote that each boy would carry a form of martyrdom, each method chosen to match not only his body but his supposed spiritual signature. He noted their temperaments, their habits, the way they bowed or the hesitation in their step. These details determined their fate, just as a craftsman chooses the right stone for a carving. To one boy he assigned silence through removal of the tongue. To another he prescribed stretching tendons to sing like strings. To another starvation in darkness infused with narcotics. Each fate was methodical, designed to test the limits of endurance while inscribing their suffering into history. What made the catalogue most disturbing was its tone. There was no frenzy, no indulgence of passion. The writing was calm, almost clinical, like a physician drafting instructions for a procedure. He described the anticipated duration of suffering, the moment when pain would shift from body to mind, and how the boy's expression should be recorded in memory. He believed that through this exactness the boys would be preserved as eternal sacrifices, their deaths not endings but transformations. To Ambrose, their screams, their collapse, and their silence were all stages of a ritual that would keep the chapel bound to permanence. When he closed the Bible each night, he ran his hand over its cover with the care of a man blessing Holy Scripture. To him, the catalogue was not a secret journal but a gospel, the truest reflection of God's demand. In his mind, God's love was not tender but consuming, and those who served had to be consumed in turn. He saw himself as the chosen instrument, the one to complete what the carved foundation stone demanded. The more he studied the catalogue, the calmer he became, as though each line confirmed that he was not lost in madness but guided by order. In the weeks that followed, the boys already chosen began to feel the weight of their priest's quiet scrutiny. He adjusted their lessons to match what he had written. The boy destined for silence was forced to recite prayers longer than the others, his voice hoarse, his throat raw. The one marked for confinement was told to sleep in a narrow cupboard behind the sacristy as a trial of humility. The boy assigned to the Song of Sinew was encouraged to practice hymns until his fingers stiffened from the organ keys. They did not know these trials were rehearsals for the ends Ambrose had already scripted, their sufferings mapped out long before they stepped into the chapel. The townsfolk continued to see only a patient priest shaping children into disciplined servants of God. They praised his dedication, admiring how the boys endured discomfort without complaint, believing it proof of piety. But the truth lay locked in the binding of that Bible where innocence had already been weighed, measured, and condemned. Each boy was no longer a child in Ambrose's eyes, but an entry in a catalogue, a specimen awaiting the moment when he would be transformed from fleeting flesh into permanent offering. At night, as the wind pressed against the shutters and the river carried its slow burden of ice downstream, Ambrose would sit alone at his desk, open the catalogue, and whisper the names to himself. He did not see the boys as separate lives, but as pieces of a greater whole, a circle that would only be complete when all 12 had been delivered. He imagined the silence of the bell tower breaking not with sound, but with the final breath of the last boy. In that silence he believed eternity would begin. And so the catalogue grew page by page as Ambrose refined his methods and matched them with the names of boys who trusted him. The study, once filled with harmless books of theology, had become a workshop of cruelty dressed in the robes of devotion. The family Bible, once a symbol of faith, had become the vessel of his darkest scripture. Outside, Millford slept under the weight of winter, never knowing that in the heart of their chapel a ledger of sacrifice had already bound their children's names to deaths too methodical to escape. The thaw had not yet come, but Ambrose was patient. He knew the time for the first offering drew closer with each day of lengthening light. He closed the Bible one final time that evening and set it on the desk beside a small copper basin, already prepared with pearl dust at the bottom. The name written at the top of the first page echoed in his mind, steady as prayer. Soon the catalogue would leave the page and breathe its first breath of suffering, and the silence of Saint Swithin's would deepen into something no bell could ever break. The night of the first offering came without warning, though Ambrose had prepared for it in silence for months. The town believed the boy, no older than 10, had wandered too close to the frozen river or fled from some childish shame. Rumors of runaways spread quickly, softened with excuses about restless youth and temptation. But in the study above the chapel, Ambrose recorded the truth in a steady hand. The child had been delivered whole, cleansed in the basin, his marrow sealed against corruption. It was not a disappearance to him, but the first step toward completion, the opening of a circle that demanded to be closed. The method had been chosen long before the boy was born. Ambrose traced it back to a Venetian practice whispered among apothecaries during the late 18th century, where nobles paid dearly for the preservation of relics. The process involved brine, copper, and pearl dust, a ritual designed to harden bone and delay decay. Those Venetian experiments had been outlawed when word spread that the subjects had not all been dead when the immersion began. Ambrose, however, did not consider that a flaw but a revelation. He believed purity must be captured while the soul still clung to the body, suspended between life and death, the marrow made eternal through the agony of drowning in salt. On that night, the chapel doors were barred from within. Parishioners passing in the street heard the iron latch fall, though none questioned it. The river's wind howled against the stone walls as Ambrose prepared the basin. It was no ordinary vessel. He had lined it with sheets of hammered copper, polished until the reflection of the candles danced across its surface like restless spirits. Into the basin he poured salt water he had drawn bucket by bucket from the Blackstone River, carrying it himself up the narrow steps, his arms trembling but his resolve never faltering. He scattered crushed pearls into the water until they floated like fragments of bone, glimmering faintly in the candlelight. The boy was led into the chamber with quiet ceremony, clothed in his altar robe, pale and thin from weeks of fasting. He believed this was another trial of obedience, another step toward the honor of Easter service. Ambrose spoke softly, assuring him that the basin was a holy vessel, and that to enter it was to mirror the baptism of Christ. The child obeyed, his trust unbroken, though his eyes darted nervously to the copper walls and the shifting surface of the salted water. Ambrose guided him into the basin, his hands steady, his breath calm, like a father helping a son into a warm bath. But the water was bitter, biting at the skin, and the boy shivered as he lowered himself into it. Ambrose held him there, whispering prayers not from Scripture but from the catalogue he had written, lines crafted to bind the moment to permanence. When the boy struggled, Ambrose pressed harder, his fingers digging into small shoulders, his eyes fixed not on the child's face but on the reflection in the copper, where his own image stared back at him with the solemnity of a priest at Mass. The boy's cries turned to muffled screams, bubbles rising like confessions swallowed by the brine. Ambrose did not see pain but purification. He believed the marrow was being sealed, the soul suspended, the body preserved beyond death. The struggle lasted longer than he expected. The body thrashed against the copper, arms flailing, knees scraping the basin's edge until the skin tore. Ambrose remained unmoved, tightening his grip, his voice rising in calm rhythm. He watched as the boy's face went from terror to slackness, as the bubbles thinned and finally stopped. Even then he did not release him. He waited until the limbs stiffened, until the silence in the room deepened into something absolute. Only then did he lift the body, water streaming from the open mouth, pearls clinging to the lips like false teeth. Ambrose laid him on the stone floor, arranging the limbs carefully, reverently, as though preparing an icon for veneration. He recorded the time, the method, and the name in his catalogue. He noted that the marrow should now be cleansed for eternity, though he wrote that the body must not be buried. Instead, he prepared a hidden chamber beneath the altar, a place he had already dug weeks earlier, where the air was cool and the stone walls held back the damp of the river. He carried the boy there in his arms, whispering the same prayer he had whispered while holding him under the brine. He laid the body upon a slab of limestone, positioning the arms across the chest, fingers interlocked as though in prayer. To Ambrose, this was not concealment, but enthronement. The boy was no longer a child, but an offering, his suffering transfigured into permanence. The next morning, when the family came searching, Ambrose received them with calm sympathy. He told them the boy had likely wandered into the woods or the river, restless and disobedient. He assured them he would pray for the child's return, his voice heavy with sorrow, but his eyes never betraying a flicker of truth. The town accepted it. Children had gone missing before, taken by rivers or storms, and the silence of the chapel bell only reinforced their resignation. No alarm was raised, no suspicion cast. The family mourned quietly, their grief muffled by the same silence that cloaked every act within Saint Swithin's. Yet those who walked near the chapel that night remembered the sound of the latch falling, the faint echo of something splashing inside, the smell of salt in the air, though the river was frozen and far from the doors. They remembered the strange glow in the priest's windows, as though the flames had burned longer and brighter than usual. Some muttered these things to themselves, but no one dared to question Ambrose. His calmness disarmed them. His steady presence lulled them into trust. They could not believe that beneath his soft voice and gentle hand lay a mind devoted to cruelty so precise it resembled faith. Ambrose, for his part, felt no guilt, no fear. He returned to his study, opened the Bible that hid his catalogue, and drew a thin line across the boy's name. One offering had been completed. 11 remained. He closed the book, pressed his hand against the cover, and listened to the silence of the bell tower above. He imagined it tolling one day, not with sound, but with the memory of 12 boys preserved in methods so exact that death itself would hesitate to claim them. He leaned back in his chair, his heart steady, his mind untroubled, and began to prepare the basin anew, already thinking of the second offering. The disappearance of 2 altar boys came only weeks after the town had accepted the first as a runaway. This time it was harder to explain, harder to soften with simple stories of river accidents or woodland wandering. 2 children do not vanish together without reason. But Ambrose Vallant had reason, and it was recorded already in his catalogue. He called this method the mortar and the bone, drawn from punishments once carried out by papal decree in the 16th century, when heretics were sealed alive within monastery walls to pray for eternity. To most it was a forgotten cruelty, outlawed and condemned. But to Ambrose it was the purest image of permanence. Stone does not rot, brick does not decay. To entomb a body in living walls was to preserve its spirit in silence, to hold innocence upright like pillars of the faith. He believed these boys had been chosen for this fate from birth, their very stature fitting the recesses he had measured behind the sacristy wall long before. He prepared the space with patient devotion. The recesses were narrow, carved into the thickness of the chapel wall, hidden behind a row of tapestries. He lined the floors with lime to dry the air and prevent quick decay, for he wanted them not to wither but to remain stiff, fixed, absorbed into the stone like living relics. When the boys were led to the chapel under the guise of late instruction, they followed obediently, unaware of the fate already written beside their names in the catalogue. Ambrose placed his hands upon their heads, whispered prayers of humility, and guided them each into a recess. They obeyed, at first thinking it some ritual trial of standing in silence. But once the bricklayer's tools emerged, their obedience collapsed into terror. Ambrose himself laid the first bricks, his hands steady, his lips moving in calm prayer as the wall grew upward, trapping them from the shoulders down. Their cries echoed against the stone vault of the chapel, muffled but not erased. Ambrose did not silence them at once. He believed the wall must absorb the sound, that the boys' voices should be pressed into mortar like water into clay, their fear becoming part of the chapel's very foundation. He fed them sparingly through a small funnel placed between the bricks, drops of water, fragments of bread soaked in wine, enough to keep them breathing, enough to stretch their suffering into days. He watched their skin pale as the lime-laced air drew the blood from their faces. He called this pallor stone-bound purity in his journal, a sign that the body was surrendering itself to permanence. He noted how the eyes dulled, how the lips cracked and peeled, how even breath seemed to slow to match the rhythm of the wall that enclosed them. To Ambrose, this was not torture, but prayer. He believed their upright posture, their arms pressed flat against stone, mirrored saints who had endured for God. But unlike saints, these children had no choice, and that was the essence of his ritual. Free will was corruption. Submission carved by force was eternity. As he worked, he spoke gently to them, calling them pillars of the chapel, assuring them their cries would be remembered in silence long after the bell had rusted. He reminded them that their suffering was not wasted but consecrated, recorded by the stones themselves. The boys screamed, begged, and pleaded, but the wall rose brick by brick, swallowing their bodies until only their faces protruded, pale and trembling like grotesque icons. For days, Ambrose continued his ministrations. He entered the chapel alone at night, lit candles at their feet, and pressed his ear to the wall to listen to their weakened voices. He fed them less with each visit, reducing them to sips of water, droplets of wine, the barest trace of bread. Their cheeks hollowed, their eyes sunk deeper until they seemed already half carved in stone. Parishioners who entered the chapel for prayer smelled something strange, a heavy scent beneath the incense that clung to their clothes. They dismissed it as the musk of damp stone or the smoke of the thurible. None guessed that behind the plastered wall 2 children were still breathing, still whispering, their existence hidden but unbroken. The end came when their voices ceased. Ambrose recorded it with satisfaction, writing that silence had finally completed them. He returned with plaster and covered the wall in smooth white, sealing their faces beneath the final layer, erasing the last sign of flesh. To him it was not burial but elevation, the boys no longer individuals but part of the chapel itself, their bones hidden but their presence eternal. He knelt before the wall, pressing his forehead against the plaster, whispering thanks for their endurance. He told himself they would hold up the chapel long after he was gone, that their silence would echo louder than the bell that still refused to ring. The town spoke of incense. They said Ambrose had taken to burning stronger blends, that the sweet and sour smoke was his way of cleansing the air during Lent. Families lit candles for the missing boys, but accepted the priest's calm reassurances that they were surely lost to river or wilderness. Ambrose's composure disarmed their doubts. He seemed wounded but unshaken, mourning without despair. No one suspected the truth, that their sons stood upright still unseen, their mouths forever closed behind plastered stone. Ambrose slept soundly that night, comforted by the knowledge that his circle of offerings was growing. He opened his catalogue and drew a line across both names, writing in the margin that their marrow was sealed in stone, their souls bound to silence. He turned the page and studied the next method, the next boy's name, the next act that would carry him further toward completion. The chapel walls seemed to hum in the silence, as though the muffled echoes of the boy's last breaths still vibrated through the mortar. He believed he heard them, faint and steady, a sound that reassured him the design was unfolding exactly as it had been carved into the foundation long before. And so he closed the Bible, extinguished the candle, and prepared to continue his work, convinced that the wall behind him no longer held children but pillars of eternity. The attic above the rectory had long been a place no one entered. Dust lay thick across its beams, and the smell of dried timber and mouse droppings discouraged even the curious. But for Ambrose Vallant, the silence of that place was not emptiness but invitation. It was here that he prepared the next act of his catalogue, one he had copied from the whispered pages of a Spanish text on the Inquisition. The story told of monks in Toledo who had been punished by being strung into frames, their tendons stretched taut across wooden pegs until their bodies became living instruments. The rumor claimed that the sound they produced when plucked was more devout than any organ hymn. Ambrose believed this method would give him the song of the willing, a harmony that would outlast flesh, the kind of music that could call eternity into the present moment. He chose the boy carefully. This child was known for his clear voice during Mass, his ability to hold a note longer than others, his small frame delicate enough to fit the dimensions Ambrose had already measured in the attic. To the parents, Ambrose spoke gently of extra duties, of training meant to refine the boy's gift. They were proud, eager to see their son lifted closer to God, never questioning why these lessons would be carried out at night behind the closed shutters of the rectory. When the boy followed Ambrose up the narrow staircase, he carried with him the trust of one who had been chosen, unaware that the wooden frame waiting in the attic was not a tool of learning but of destruction. The construction was simple in appearance but cruel in design, a heavy cross frame of oak, fitted with copper pegs polished to gleam in the candlelight, stood upright beneath the rafters. Beside it lay knives honed for precision, small as a surgeon's, meant not for killing but for cutting just beneath the skin. Ambrose bound the boy to the frame with straps of leather, his hands and feet fixed, His body stretched so that no movement was possible beyond the rise and fall of breath. He whispered prayers of courage, assuring the child he was part of a sacred music no one else could ever perform. The boy trembled, confused, but said nothing, his silence already part of the ritual. Ambrose began with small incisions at the wrists and ankles, careful, exact, drawing out the glistening threads of tendon with the skill of a man dissecting for study. He did not flinch at the cries that followed, nor at the way the boy's body shook against the frame. Instead, he hummed softly, testing the tension of each strand before fastening it to the copper pegs. He worked slowly, methodically, as though tuning an instrument. Each tendon was tightened, stretched until it quivered, the boy's pain sharpening into sound. Ambrose plucked one with his finger, and the note it produced was high, thin, trembling like the cry of a bird caught in a storm. He smiled, writing in his mind that this was finer than any organ pipe. The process took hours. The boy shifted between screams and whimpers, his voice breaking, then fading into hoarse gasps as his body was transformed piece by piece. Ambrose never faltered. To him, the suffering was not cruelty but composition. Each sound another note in the hymn he believed would bind the chapel to eternity. When the frame was complete, when the boy's limbs were fixed and his tendons stretched in a lattice of shining chords, Ambrose struck them in sequence, listening as the attic filled with unnatural music. It was a sound no parishioner would ever hear, yet Ambrose believed it was heard in heaven, carried upward with each vibration, sanctified by the agony that created it. The boy lived through the night, his body twitching each time a note was drawn. Ambrose returned again and again, plucking at the chords, adjusting their tension, refining the pitch as though he were tuning a harp. He recorded each detail in his catalogue, the strength of the sound, the duration of breath, the way the marrow seemed to stiffen beneath the strain. He wrote that the boy had been willing, that his cries were not resistance but harmony, a gift offered to the eternal silence that demanded it. He convinced himself that the suffering was consent, that endurance was devotion. When death finally came, it was not sudden but gradual, a fading of sound as the chords slackened with the body's collapse. Ambrose stood in silence, his hand resting on the frame, his eyes closed as though listening to the last echo. He did not bury the boy, nor release him. He left the body fixed in place, nailed the attic door shut, and spread dust across the floor to mask the signs of entry. To him, the frame was not a corpse, but an instrument preserved in silence, waiting to be discovered by no one. He told himself that eternity required hidden music, that the song of the willing would remain trapped in those rafters long after he had finished the circle. Downstairs, the town whispered of another disappearance. A mother wept in the street, a father demanded answers, but Ambrose met them with calm sorrow. He told them the boy had likely wandered to the river as others had, his voice heavy with pity, his eyes steady, his hands folded as if in prayer. His composure subdued their suspicion, even as the scent of copper seemed to cling to his robes. He promised to pray for the child's return, knowing full well the boy was still above their heads, stretched into silence, his body turned into a hymn no ear would ever hear again. Ambrose returned to his study that night, opened his catalogue, and drew another line across another name. He wrote that the sound had been true, the notes finer than any instrument built by man. He closed the Bible, extinguished the candle, and sat in the darkness, listening not to the wind or the river, but to the imagined music still ringing in his ears. The circle was tightening, each act of cruelty binding the chapel more firmly to silence. He felt no guilt, only patience, for there were still names left to cross, still methods left to complete. And as long as the bell tower above remained mute, he believed he was moving closer to eternity. Beneath the confessional of Saint Swithin's was a crawl space no parishioner knew existed. It had been dug by Ambrose himself, scraped out with quiet patience until it was large enough to cradle a body. He lined it with wood planks, set a thin mattress on the earth, and left only a narrow hole in the wall to pass water and scraps. Into this darkness he lowered the sixth boy, chosen not for his voice or obedience, but for the restlessness in his hands. The child fidgeted during prayers, picked at the hems of his sleeves, and once reached toward the chalice without permission. Ambrose wrote in his catalogue that such hands could not be trusted. They had to be sealed, transformed, remade into purity through pain. The ritual he designed for him was not of silence by voice, but silence by touch. For weeks the boy remained hidden beneath the floorboards, his world reduced to darkness and the sound of feet shuffling above. Ambrose starved him deliberately, feeding only enough to keep him alive, a heel of bread softened in water, sometimes a few grains scattered on a cloth. The water itself was never clean. Ambrose infused it with crushed poppy resin, a narcotic that softened the boy's resistance and blurred his sense of time. The child drifted in and out of sleep, waking to the smell of incense, the muffled weight of whispered confessions, the murmur of Ambrose's voice above. He no longer knew day from night. His body weakened, his skin sank to bone. Yet Ambrose called this thinning a fast of the spirit, a hollowing meant to make room for God. The true torment came not from hunger, but from the mutilation of his hands. Ambrose pried the boy's fingernails out one by one, using small hooks taken from surgical instruments gifted by physicians who had once admired his scholarly calm. The child screamed in the dark, the sound muffled by the earth and the wood above. Ambrose worked without haste, setting aside the bloodied crescents, pressing silver slivers into the raw beds where nails had once grown. He told himself this was sealing the hands from sin, a practice he had read about in the secret annals of a 17th-century sect in the Papal States. They believed silver repelled corruption, that the touch of a sealed hand could never again stray toward temptation. Ambrose convinced himself he was not punishing but purifying, not destroying but reforging the boy's very essence. The effect was grotesque. In the darkness, the boy's fingers swelled, blistered, broke, and bled around the shining metal. When he moved them, they tapped faintly against the planks, a sound unlike anything heard in the chapel before. Parishioners kneeling above mistook it for the settling of wood, or perhaps the rattling of rosary beads dropped against the booth. Only those who listened closely realized it was rhythmic, a slow, metallic tapping, as if someone beneath the floor was trying to join their prayers. Ambrose did nothing to silence it. He wanted the sound to seep into the confessions, to haunt the penitents with an unseen witness. To him, every tap was proof that the ritual was working, that the child's suffering had become part of the sacrament itself. As days stretched into weeks, the boy's body weakened further. His breath grew shallow, his stomach hollowed into itself, his voice reduced to whimpers too faint to reach above the confessional. Only the tapping continued, the silver nails clicking against wood like a clock running down its last measure of time. Ambrose visited often, kneeling by the hole, whispering that he was close to salvation, that the pain meant his sins were being burned away. The boy could not understand, his thoughts broken by hunger and narcotic haze, but he tapped still, perhaps in despair, perhaps in blind instinct, perhaps in the hope that someone above might hear. Ambrose called it obedience, the sign of a willing martyr. When death finally arrived, it was not sudden. The tapping slowed over 2 nights, grew erratic, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against the wood like the weight of the grave. Parishioners noticed at once. Those who had prayed in the booth felt unsettled, whispering that something had changed. They asked Ambrose if the confessional had been repaired, for the strange sound that had once accompanied their prayers was gone. Ambrose lowered his eyes, murmured that silence itself was a blessing, and assured them that the booth had been renewed by their devotion. His calmness smothered their unease, and no one dared press further. Beneath the planks, Ambrose laid the boy's body out, fingers stiff and silvered, skin waxen from starvation. He wrapped him in linen, not to bury but to store, sliding him into a recess in the wall he had prepared beforehand. He believed the boy had been perfected, his hands sealed, his voice erased, his body purified by the slow decay of hunger. He wrote in his catalogue that this offering was among the purest, that the metallic tapping had sanctified every confession whispered above it, binding the sins of the parish to the silence of the dead. He described the boy's final state as a vessel emptied of self, filled instead with the permanence of suffering. That night, Ambrose returned to his study, opened the Bible that hid his ledger, and drew a line across the boy's name. He wrote beside it a single phrase, sealed in silence. He closed the book, extinguished the candle, and listened to the absence of sound, to the confessional above, now still as stone. The chapel seemed to breathe with him, its silence deepening, its air heavy with the scent of incense meant to cover rot. He believed the circle was holding, that each act of suffering was weaving the parish more tightly into eternity. And so, without hesitation, he turned the page to the next name, already envisioning the method that would carry it forward. The season of Lent drew the town of Millford into deeper silence, and in that silence Ambrose Vallant prepared for his most grotesque act yet. He had chosen 3 boys this time, their names inscribed together in his catalogue as though they were a single entry. To him they were not individuals, but a chorus of flesh meant to embody one principle: that words are corruption, that tongues are the instruments of betrayal, and that to silence them was to preserve innocence from the ruin of speech. He had read of a practice in Persian courts where traitors' tongues were removed, their voices stored in jars for the judgment of kings. That image had lodged itself deep within his mind, reshaped into a ritual he believed would sanctify his circle. For him, the tongue was not only flesh, but a symbol of truth and lies, and by severing it, he believed he could keep the purity of a child's voice forever, embalmed in beeswax and preserved like relics of forgotten saints. He chose the night carefully, when the streets were empty and the fasting of Lent had already softened the will of the town. The boys were led into the chapel under the pretense of midnight devotion, clothed in their altar robes, their heads bowed in trust. They believed they were being honored, drawn deeper into the mysteries of the faith. Ambrose moved with calm authority, guiding them not to pews but to the altar itself, where he had already set the instruments of his work. Jars of beeswax warmed by candles stood waiting. Knives honed to a surgeon's sharpness glinted in the dim light. Cloths soaked in vinegar lay folded beside them, their stinging scent hidden beneath the heavier smoke of incense. The boys knelt as instructed, their eyes fixed on the crucifix above. Ambrose approached each one in turn, his hands steady, his face serene. He pressed the vinegar-soaked cloths into their mouths, gagging them with what he described later as holy bindings. Their muffled cries echoed faintly, swallowed by the stone vaults of the chapel. Then he began the work. With swift, precise incisions, he severed their tongues, pulling each out like a parasite removed from a host. Blood filled their mouths, but the cloths absorbed it, darkening until they dripped onto their robes. Ambrose placed each tongue into a beeswax jar, sealing it carefully as though he were preserving relics. He wrote later that the tongues still twitched as they sank into the wax, as though unwilling to surrender their last word. The boys were not killed outright. That was not Ambrose's design. He wanted them alive, silenced but breathing, their voices removed, yet their eyes wide open. He arranged them around the altar, kneeling in forced devotion, their heads bound upright so they could not collapse. They gagged on their own blood, their throats convulsing, but the vinegar stung enough to slow the flow, keeping them from choking too soon. Ambrose watched them with clinical calm, recording the hue of their skin, the dilation of their pupils, the trembling of their limbs. He described their eyes as refusing to dim bright even as the night passed, as if they understood too much yet could not speak a word of it. Hours dragged on. The boys swayed, their bodies weakening, but Ambrose forced them upright again and again, whispering that silence was the truest prayer. He kept vigil through the night, lighting fresh candles as the old ones guttered out, the jars of beeswax lined neatly before him like vessels of holy oil. He wrote in his ledger that the chapel itself seemed to listen, that the absence of sound from the boys created a vacuum filled only by the crackle of wax and flame. He believed the ritual had bound their innocence in permanence, that their suffering was not wasted but transformed into a hymn too deep for words. When sunrise came, the boys could no longer hold themselves upright. One collapsed first, his knees cracking against the stone, blood seeping from beneath the gag. The others followed soon after, their bodies trembling with the last efforts of breath. Ambrose watched without intervening, noting how long the eyes remained alive after the bodies failed. He was fascinated by the brightness that lingered, the way the gaze clung to the world even as the chest no longer rose. He described it as a refusal to dim, proof that silence was stronger than flesh, that their souls had been fixed in the moment of offering. By the time the parishioners entered later that morning, Ambrose had removed all trace. The boys' bodies were taken to a hidden chamber beneath the sacristy, wrapped and laid out in silence. The altar had been cleansed, the blood scrubbed away, the jars of beeswax hidden behind the false back of a cabinet. To the town, the boys were simply missing, another mystery added to the tally of vanished children. Families wept, whispers grew, but none dared confront Ambrose, whose calm sorrow seemed too genuine to question. He assured them he prayed for the missing every night, his eyes lowered, his voice steady, his hands folded as though untainted by cruelty. Yet above the altar, in the faint light of morning, some parishioners claimed they smelled vinegar mixed with incense, a sharpness that burned the nose and lingered on their clothes. Others thought they heard something faint, like a whisper trapped in the stone, though no mouths moved. They dismissed it as imagination, as grief, as fatigue from fasting. None guessed the truth, that beneath their feet, sealed in wax, 3 tongues twitched still, preserved for a judgment that would never come. That night, Ambrose opened his catalogue once more, drew lines across 3 names and wrote in the margin, "Their voices kept." He closed the Bible, set his pen down, and sat in silence, the jars beside him cooling into permanence. He convinced himself the chapel was fuller now, not emptier. Its silence bound to their stolen voices, its stones vibrating with the echoes of words that would never be spoken again. The bell tower above remained mute, but in Ambrose's mind it no longer needed to ring. The silence itself had become the sound of eternity. Easter morning arrived cold and bright, the sky washed pale as though the world itself had been scoured clean. The bells of neighboring towns rang in celebration, but at Saint Swithin's the tower remained silent, its rope untouched, its metal tongue still as death. For Ambrose Vallant, this silence was not neglect but fulfillment. He had already crossed 9 names from his catalogue, each death methodical, each ritual precise, each child preserved in ways that defied the ordinary corruption of flesh. Now only 3 remained, the final offering required to seal the circle carved in the chapel's foundation stone. Ambrose had prepared them with weeks of fasting, isolation, and whispered scripture until they no longer fought his commands. By the time he clothed them for the procession, they moved with a calm that seemed unnatural. Their eyes empty, their bodies obedient to his will. He dressed them in full altar robes, white as lamb's wool, the fabric trailing behind them like shrouds. Around their waists he clasped heavy chains, binding them together so that none could move without the others. Then he took the wax masks he had crafted in the rectory, each molded with care into the likeness of the Virgin Mary. The faces were smooth, expressionless, their features fixed in the serenity of prayer. He fastened the masks to the boys' heads, sealing them with cloth strips soaked in oil so they clung tight, allowing only small holes for breath. To Ambrose, these were not disguises but transformations. He believed the boys had become vessels, their innocence clothed in the image of the Mother of God, their silence now holy. Before dawn he led them from the chapel. The chains clinked softly, their steps slow and synchronized, their robes whispering against the stones. Ambrose carried his Bible, though he no longer needed its words. He had memorized what he required from the Book of Lamentations, verses of sorrow and ruin that he recited under his breath as he walked. The boys followed without resistance, their masked faces turned forward, their hands bound at their sides. No cries, no struggle, only the steady sound of chains, a rhythm that echoed against the stillness of the town. Anyone who might have seen them that morning would have mistaken them for a funeral procession, and in a sense, they would not have been wrong. The Blackstone River waited at the edge of town, swollen with meltwater, its current dark and swift. Ambrose had chosen this place long ago. He believed water was the truest grave, a force that consumed without mark, erasing bodies yet leaving memory behind. To him, drowning was not annihilation but baptism perfected, a final immersion that cleansed not only sin but life itself. He guided the boys to the riverbank, their feet sinking into the mud, the hem of their robes already damp with silt. He stood behind them, murmuring psalms that spoke of desolation, of walls broken down, of children led away in silence. His voice was calm, measured like the priest he still appeared to be, though his mind burned with the certainty that eternity lay only a step away. The boys stepped into the water as though compelled, their movements slow but without hesitation. The chains dragged at their waists, pulling them closer together as the current rose against their legs. The masks gleamed pale against the dark river, their features unchanging, their silence absolute. Ambrose continued his recitation, his voice carrying over the sound of rushing water. The boys advanced further, their robes billowing with the pull of the current, their bodies shivering but their steps unbroken. When the water reached their chests, Ambrose lifted his hands as though blessing them, and the three lowered themselves fully, swallowed by the river's pull. He watched as they disappeared, the surface breaking only with the faint gleam of wax as the masks tilted upward. Then even those were gone, swallowed into the current, carried downstream into shadow. Ambrose stood unmoving, the Book of Lamentations open in his hand, his lips whispering until no trace remained. He did not wade in after them nor call out. To him their obedience had been perfect, their submission total. They had walked willingly into silence, their innocence preserved by water, their voices removed without knife or fire but by surrender. He recorded later that they were the most complete of all his offerings, for they resisted nothing, as though the river itself had called them. No bodies were ever recovered. The town searched along the banks, dragging the waters, probing with poles, but the river returned nothing. Families wept and raged, some blaming the water, others whispering of wolves or bandits. Ambrose moved among them with quiet sorrow, assuring them he prayed for the lost, his calm presence soothing suspicion. His composure disarmed their grief just as it had with all the others. Yet weeks later, when the thaw had passed and the current slowed, The masks began to surface. 3 wax faces, pale and unbroken, floated to the river's edge, their features serene, their eyes empty. They washed ashore near the mill, frightening those who found them, for no one could explain how they remained intact when the river tore at everything else. The masks were brought back to the chapel, laid before the altar as evidence, but Ambrose only bowed his head. He told the parishioners that such objects were signs of God's mystery, reminders that innocence could never be destroyed, only transformed. Some accepted his words, desperate for meaning, while others shuddered in silence. The masks were later buried in the churchyard, but their image lingered in memory, pale faces staring from the dark river, a procession that seemed eternal. That night, Ambrose returned to his study. He opened his catalogue, drew 3 lines across 3 names, and wrote, "Delivered by water, faces unbroken." He closed the book with care, pressed his hand against its cover, and listened to the silence of the chapel above. The bell tower stood mute, but he no longer expected it to ring. For him, the true sound of completion was not the peal of metal, but the silence of 12 boys carried away, sealed in stone, wax, copper, and water. He believed the circle was closed, that eternity now belonged to him. Yet the silence in the room was heavier than before, as though the chapel itself had absorbed the weight of the drowned, holding their presence in the walls, in the air, in the very floor beneath his feet. When Ambrose Vallant vanished, he left no trace of struggle, no trail of flight. One morning the rectory was found empty, his study dark, the Bible that hid his catalogue gone from the desk. The parishioners whispered that perhaps he had drowned himself in the river, drawn to the same waters that had swallowed the altar boys. Others suggested he had been summoned back to Quebec, though no letter ever arrived, no summons ever documented. His absence did not feel like an accident. It felt like a decision, a departure at the moment when suspicion would have begun to press too close. What remained was his silence, heavier than ever, settling into the stones of Saint Swithin's like mildew. For decades, Saint Swithin stood sealed, its silence deepening until demolition in the 1870s uncovered Ambrose Vallant's ledger beneath the altar. Inside were the boys' names, their deaths detailed with chilling precision, each marked not as murder but as offering. The final line read, "All 12 delivered whole, unmarred by time." Yet one more name followed, St. Bartholomew's 13th, beside a crude drawing of a nailed hand, and pinned to the page, a real mummified child's hand. The book was hidden away in Quebec, but Millford never forgot. The ground remained bare, the silence heavier than stone, waiting. In Millford, silence became its only inheritance. The ruins of Saint Swithin's rotted into the ground, yet people swore they still heard the faint tapping from the old confessional, or the muffled cries of children sealed beneath stone. The river itself carried whispers, voices rising at night like drowned prayers. The ledger uncovered beneath the altar had revealed the truth, but truth did not heal. It only carved the wound deeper, showing that evil had been dressed in robes, spoken with calmness, hidden behind devotion. The townspeople tried to bury their shame with the chapel's rubble, but the earth refused to forget. Attempts to rebuild failed, as if the ground itself rejected weight after bearing the silence of 12 children. Laws were quietly written in Providence, cloaked in vague phrases like foreign abuses of devotion, but everyone who remembered knew why. Even the memorial raised by the Blackstone was blank, only the year carved into stone. In 1911, when a fisherman pulled a child's skull from the river, a sliver of silver still gleaming in its nail. The past rose again, yet it too was buried without name. And so the warning remains. Evil rarely screams. It whispers, it prays, it waits for silence to shield it. Could it happen again?